Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. This time out, the most powerful version of SSL's bus compressor yet. Let's get started. Today we're checking out the Bus Plus from SSL, the latest version of their legendary bus compressor. But the Bus Plus goes way beyond just compression, as we'll see. The SSL Bus Compressor was first introduced in 1976 as part of the 4000B console. Then it was released as a separate rack processor in 1991, so anyone could apply it to their mixes regardless of what console they were using. And since then, we've seen versions for 500 series racks, we've seen versions for the X-Rack system, and of course many plug-in emulations of that legendary processor as well. The SSL Bus Compressor is so legendary because of the way it glues a mix together, the way it brings things together, adds punch, and just makes everything sound bigger and tighter. The Bus Plus can do all of that for us as well, but as I mentioned, it has a variety of extended features too. The Bus Plus is 100% analog. The signal is never converted into digital, but we do have digital control over all the parameters and functions, and this gives us some extended capabilities as well as extreme accuracy. So audio never actually passes through the potentiometer. These are actually step switches, not potentiometers, and audio never flows through them. And that allows for extremely accurate stereo tracking between the two sides of the unit, less than 0.1 dB of difference between them. SSL spent more than 2.5 years developing the Bus Plus, and that's so they could keep that original sound quality of that original circuit, 100% faithful to the original, while still adding things like a dynamic EQ. This is a 2-band EQ that responds to the input signal. We've also got a transient expander built in. We've got an external sidechain input and output that allows us a variety of processing capabilities. And we've also got 4 modes of operation for this unit. I think it's easier to see what's happening if we take a tour of the front panel and check out some of these functions. The Bus Plus may look like a complex processor with a lot of control capability, and it is. It does a lot of things for us, but you can break it down, and it becomes much simpler to operate if you recognize that the blue controls are controlling the parameters for the compression, the black controls are controlling the parameters for the EQ, and then we've got switches that allow some of those extended functions that I mentioned. The Bus Plus offers 4 modes of operation. The first is classic stereo, and this is the way you'd use this on a stereo output bus for your mix. By pressing the mode button once, we can move to sum stereo. Now the actual audio signal is not summed to stereo. What's summed to stereo is a sidechain. And this makes the compressor more sensitive to the mono elements that are in the center of your mix. So your kick drum, your bass, your vocal, your snare drum, those kind of things that typically sit in the center of your mix, the compressor is going to be more sensitive to those now. And for certain mixes, that can work very well. If we push the mode switch again, we go to dual mono, and that turns this into 2 completely separate compressors inside one unit. So left side, right side, input 1, input 2. Our 4th mode is mid-side, and this allows you to compress the center of your signal separately from the outside of your signal, or the sides, the left-right. And this can provide some great functionality for mastering, for example, where you can kind of rebalance what's happening in the center versus what's happening on the outside and process those separately, both with EQ and with compression. We can move backward through the modes with a longer press. So this allows for easy A-Bing. We've got overall bypass for the compressor. If we're in, for example, dual mono, we can bypass separately. If we go back to stereo, we have an overall bypass. One other nice thing with the channel bypass switches is they actually turn red when you overload any stage within the Bus Plus, so that gives you an instant overload indication. Let's take a closer look at the compressor functions inside the Bus Plus. The Bus Plus uses that 2181 VCAs, which sound fantastic. And that VCA response gives us that classic SSL sound when we're using the Bus Plus. We've got a couple of interesting extended features here that we'll get into, but first let's look at the controls. Again, all the controls are blue. As I mentioned, all of the controls are actually stepped, they're not pots, and this makes it very easy to recall settings. You can dial right back to where you were previously. We've got a standard threshold control that sets when the compressor begins to go into action. We've got a ratio control, and they've added some extra ratios here. They're actually negative ratios. Those negative ratios give you more options for creating special effects like pumping effects, or for working with extremely dynamic or extremely high-level signals. We also have more flexible attack and release options than you have on the traditional SSL bus compressor. They've added some additional attack times to give you more versatility here, and we now have 2 auto-release settings on the release control. Now, the auto-release inside the Bus Plus is actually a 2-stage process. It actually processes loud signals differently than it processes soft signals with different release times. This makes it sound very natural, and having two different settings means you can really dial in that auto release to work with the signal you're passing through the processor. Moving on, we've got the makeup gain control, and we actually have two modes for this. There's the standard mode, and then we also have a fine mode where we're in half dB increments. Below the makeup gain control, we have the mix control, and this sets the balance of the processed signal versus the dry or unprocessed signal. And there are two modes you can set this to. In classic mode, the mix control basically pans between wet and dry. So as you turn that down, the signal gets drier and drier, and as you turn it up, you move more and more toward 100% wet. The second mode is a parallel mode. In this mode, the dry signal stays constant, and you blend the wet signal in against the dry signal. This gives us parallel compression, which is so effective on drums as well as on overall mixes. Our final control for the compressor section is sidechain high-pass filter. This allows us to take out low frequencies in the sidechain up to 300 Hz and changes the response of the compressor accordingly. Now we have some other extended features here that are really cool. First of all, we can set to low THD, which is total harmonic distortion mode. When we engage that switch, the bottom end gets cleaner. There's less distortion, and this is really great for mastering applications. Next up, we have the feed-forward, feedback switch. And this changes where the sidechain is taking its signal from. When we're in feed-forward, it's taking the signal from before the compressor. When we're in feedback, it's taking it after the compressor. And this is the way some other compressors work, some other popular bus compressors work, and it gives you a little bit more relaxed feel to the compression. We can also change the compressor to operate in 4K mode, and this is the way that the original bus compressors in the 4000 series consoles operated. Basically, the VCA was unbalanced in those consoles, which gave an additional grit and distortion to the sound. And the cool thing here is not only can we engage that 4K mode, but we can actually set the level of the distortion. So if we press and hold, that button flashes, and now the low THD and the feed-forward switch become up and down. And we have 9 levels of distortion that are indicated by different colors on the 4K mode switch. And then we press and hold and go back to where we were. So let's set that back down. We'll turn back down to clean operation, take us out of 4K mode, and we're back to the standard operation for the bus compressor. Now let's talk about the DEQ, or the dynamic EQ section of the Bus Plus. This is a 2-band equalizer, but it's dynamic, meaning that it responds to the incoming signal. If we have a lot of low end coming in, it'll either compress or expand just the low end, depending on how we have things set up, and likewise with the high frequencies as well. And we have a lot of control over this. So first of all, we can set whether we're compressing or expanding the low frequencies and the high frequencies. We can also bypass or engage the low frequencies and the high frequencies individually as well. We have 3 time constants for each of the low and the high frequencies, and we can set those using these switches here. So when the switch is off on the high frequencies, we have a 3 millisecond attack and a 50 millisecond release. When the switch is on, we now have a 1 millisecond attack and a 50 millisecond release. So this is fast operation. When we press and hold, the button turns magenta, and now at this point we have a 10 millisecond attack time, but an auto release function. Let's turn that off. Put us back to fast. On the low frequencies, we have a 30 millisecond attack and a 50 millisecond release. Engaging fast mode gives us 10 millisecond attack and 50 millisecond release. And then we can also put this into auto release mode, 10 millisecond attack and auto release. By default, the low frequency band is at 60 Hz and the high frequency band is at 6 kilohertz. We can also switch the high frequency band to a bell instead of a shelf, in which case that bell centers at 4 kilohertz. But it doesn't stop with just those default settings. We can independently adjust the frequencies for each band as well as the range for each band. And we do that by pressing and holding the particular band, and you see the VU meters both jump up when we do that. By using the high frequency and low frequency switches here, we can adjust the frequencies, 16 different frequencies for the low frequency band, and we can adjust the range for that band using the high frequency, low frequency switches up to 15 dB. In this case, the VU meter tells us pretty much exactly what we're doing. So if we go to 12 dB on the VU meter, we have a 12 dB range. When you're finished, just press and hold the knob again, and you go back to standard operation. Rounding things out, we have independent gain control for the 2 bands. Low frequency is here, high frequency is over here. The red light indicates that this is now controlling high frequency gain. If we press the low frequency gain control, we go into G series mode. This gives us a slightly different EQ response. We switch from a 12 dB per octave curve to a more gentle 6 dB per octave curve, and there's also more overshoot when you're in the G series. It's a slightly different response that works very well for certain sounds. We can choose to set the routing for the compressor in the EQ. In the standard operation, the EQ is actually in front of the compressor. If we press the makeup gain control, now we've switched the EQ to where it's after the compressor. At this point, we should also talk about the external sidechain input and output on the back panel. These allow you to use an external audio signal to control the Bus Plus, or vice versa, to use the sidechain from this to control an external processor. Now we can route that incoming sidechain signal to either the compressor, the EQ, both, or to neither. But we're not done yet. We have a variety of functions we can access in setup mode as well. You access setup mode by holding the mode switch while you power the unit on. And at this point, you can do things like set the brightness for the LEDs on the front panel. You can also set the input gain trim to match the incoming signal levels. You can turn the relay clicks on and off if you don't want that audio feedback when you push and release the different buttons. This is where we set up the parallel and classic settings for the mix control. We can also engage a 26 kilohertz low-pass filter. And this is important because certain audio interfaces put out very high frequencies that are out of band, and they can actually cause the sidechain to trigger inside the Bus Plus. So by filtering out those out-of-band frequencies, we get cleaner response. And there's much more you can do as well. You can do a factory reset and more. There's so many functions here. Now, as I mentioned, there's a lot of controls here, a lot of different things you can do, but it's pretty simple once you break it down to the compressor, the EQ, and then the extended functions. Once you spend some time with it, it'll become very natural operating this unit. Let's take a quick listen. I've got a mix here that we'll run through. I'll engage and bypass. We'll change some of the different settings, but I think you'll hear that classic SSL bus compressor operation, as well as some of those different EQ things we can engage and disengage. So we'll begin by turning off our EQ, and we'll listen to just the compressor on the mix. I'll bypass. Here's our dry mix. As you can hear, some of those functions are fairly subtle when you engage them and disengage them, but the overall effect can be very dramatic on your overall mix, so you can really fine-tune things here. And this makes the Bus Plus equally useful for individual signals when you're tracking or when you're mixing, for stereo bus output to compress your overall stereo mix, or for mastering applications as well. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the SSL the Bus Plus. It's an incredibly powerful processor that can bring so much life, so much energy, so much desirable coloration to your mixes and to your masters as well. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Click here for more videos like this, or start at sweetwater.com for all your music instrument and pro audio needs.